Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and good to see you all here today. So we've been studying this text of Eihei Dogen's called the Fukan Zazenji, which is about sitting meditation. It's about Zazen. And in this text, Dogen is trying to acquaint us with this practice in as concise a manner as he can and as accurately as he can. And last time, we focused on the part of the Fukan Zazenji that has to do with physical positioning of the body and the importance of that. So everyone has to come to terms with that aspect of Zazen by applying it to their particular body. And some people can apply his instructions to the letter, and other people have to modify those instructions because of the limitations of their particular body, and that's expected. But then Master Dogen goes into a discussion of what to do with mind. And there it gets rather subtle because in a way, when you're trying to teach someone a physical activity, when you're trying to teach gymnastics or when you're trying to teach piano playing, you can actually show them what you're doing physically and demonstrate this is how you do it. But when you're talking about a mental activity, it's more subtle. And Dogen can't really show us how to do this. It's something we have to work with ourselves. But he does his best at giving us some guidance, some direction in this mental activity of Zazen. So the section in this translation that I'm reading now goes like this. Once you have adjusted your posture, take a deep breath, inhale and exhale, rock your body right and left, settle into a steady, immobile sitting position. Think, not thinking. How do you think not thinking? Non-thinking. This in itself is the essential art of Zazen. The Zazen I speak of is not learning meditation. It is simply the Dharma gate of repose and bliss, the practice realization of totally culminated enlightenment. It is the manifestation of ultimate reality. Traps and snares can never reach it. Once its heart is grasped, you are like the dragon when he gains the water, like the tiger when she enters the mountain. For you must know that just there in Zazen, the right Dharma is manifesting itself, and that from the first, dullness and distraction are struck aside. Well, Dogen begins that exposition of what to do with the mind during Zazen by referring to a Zen story a Zen story that goes something like this, and it relates to Zen Master Yao Shan, who was actually a student of Shito, who wrote the Grass Hut poem that we studied previously. So Yao Shan lived a little bit after Shito and was a Zen priest and teacher. But one day, and this story has, that has the usual form of Zen stories where there's a monk that comes up and asks the priest or the teacher or the abbot a question or makes a statement, and then the priest responds. But it goes like this. So the monk comes up one day while Yao Shan is sitting in meditation. And the monk asks, Master Yao Shan, what are you thinking when you sit there steadfast like a mountain? And Yao Shan responds, I'm thinking of not thinking. And the monk says, well, how do you think of not thinking? And Yao Shan responds, non-thinking. And that's where you're left at the end of the story. We'll talk more about this word that's used, non-thinking, which is a single word in Japanese that Dogen used. But just a few comments before we do that. I tend to think of this as not eliminating thoughts, but changing one's relationship with thoughts. A phrase that's often used by Dogen and others in the Zen tradition is taking the backward step, stepping away from thoughts, and just seeing them as they arise and as they cease, without getting involved with them, without possessing them. Oftentimes, in our usual mode of thinking, we consider our thoughts ours. They're sort of, in a way, we identify with them. They're who we are. Whether we had this thought, oh, that was a terrible thought. I must be a worse person than I thought I was. We identify with thoughts. But thoughts actually have their own life. They arise and cease constantly. They have their own causes and conditions, and we don't often know where they come from. We don't know where they go. We just experience them as they pass through the mind. And sometimes we pick them up and start doing things with them. We manipulate them. We execute operations on them, just like numbers. Like if you have just a stream of numbers coming through the mind, that's just one experience. But if you start taking a couple numbers and adding them together, or multiplying them, or dividing them by one another, or comparing them and saying this number is greater than that number, then you're executing operations on those numbers. And likewise, we take thoughts and we operate on them. We weave them together into a narrative sometimes. And of course, it's useful to be able to do that. It's part of what makes us human. There's nothing wrong with it. But it's not the Zazen that Dogen is talking about. The Zazen that Dogen is talking about is to refrain from doing that. And that's kind of a subtle art. He describes it as the art of Zazen. The essential art of Zazen is to refrain from making things with our thoughts or with the thoughts that arise. So in a way, there's a correspondence between what you're doing with your body and what you're doing with your mind. What you're doing with your body is refraining from motion, refraining from getting up and checking the mail or whatever. You're just sitting there still as you can, as still as humanly possible, refraining from motion. And in the mind, we're refraining from playing with our thoughts, just noticing them come and go. It's a subtle skill, and it does take some practice, and you don't really master it. In a way, it masters you. And I think it's fair to say that for most people, you never just sit there for 30 minutes without starting to play with your thoughts. There will be a thought that is just irresistible. And you start playing with it, and then you notice that you're playing with it. And that noticing is part of the art of Zazen. You notice you're playing with it, and then you put it down. You just let it be. Now, there can be devices to kind of help, such as paying attention to the breath or performing some chant repeatedly, something to give the mind something to do so it's not so tempted to start manipulating thoughts. And these are all fine. But the Zazen that Dogen is talking about is just to sit there and refrain from weaving narratives, from playing with your thoughts. So there is the Japanese word for non-thinking is Hishiro. 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 Shiro is thinking. Hishiro is non-thinking. No thinking is fushiro, so it's a different word. And I think it's helpful to explore this a little bit. And one way of exploring it is to look at a different translation. And that section I read in another translation goes, how do you think of not thinking? Beyond thinking. This is the essential way of Zazen. The Zazen which I am talking about is not step-by-step meditation. It is simply the Dharma gate of peace and comfort. It is the practice enlightenment of the ultimate way. In doing Zazen, the koan manifests itself. It cannot be ensnared. When you grasp this, you are like a dragon with water or a tiger in the mountains. You must know that the true Dharma manifests itself in Zazen, and the dullness and distraction drop away. So instead of non-thinking, this translator said beyond thinking. And sort of a more wordy translation would be not in the manner of thinking. But it is certainly not the absence of thoughts. It's a change in our relationship to thoughts. Now, there's a Reverend Tusoda was a 20th century scholar of Zen and also a priest. He taught at Komazawa University in Japan, and his specialty within the Department of Philosophy was philology, or the history of language. So he looked at this Hishiro word and found it in some of Dogen's, some of the writings that preceded Dogen. Most notably, it was in the poem called Faith and Mind, or Faith in Mind, by Senkan. And Senkan lived about 200 years before Shuto, so it goes way back. And in that poem, he says, the empty enlightenment illuminates itself. There is no need for the slightest mental effort. It is a realm of non-thinking, Hishiro, a realm beyond the apprehension of reasoning and emotions. And there are some other references that this scholar points out, but he also points out that there are more than one version of the Fukan Zazenji that are extant. And in another version, which he describes as the Tempuku version of the Fukan Zazenji, the wording is a little different. We don't see in that version the sentence, think of not thinking, how do you think of it non-thinking? Instead, there are these sentences. When a thought arises, be aware of it. When you are aware of it, it will disappear. Continuously put aside everything outside and make yourself into one piece. I'll read that again. Instead, there are these sentences. When a thought arises, be aware of it. When you are aware of it, it will disappear. Continuously put aside everything outside and make yourself into one piece. So a different perspective on the notion of Hishiro, non-thinking, just being aware of thoughts, and again, not becoming entangled in thoughts. Well, so what's the point of doing this? Here it gets a little tricky because we tend to think of, if you're going to spend 30 minutes or 40 minutes or 60 minutes or a whole day or a week or 10 days doing something, you ought to be doing it for a specific purpose. But paradoxically, trying to think about a specific purpose for doing Zazen kind of poisons the water. So the activity itself has its greatest value if you just don't go there and just have faith in the practice and perform Zazen for the sake of Zazen, as Dogen says. It is, I think, practice in restraint. And practice in restraint has a number, I think, of practical advantages. When we restrain the impulses to move the body, when we restrain the impulses to grab a thought and run with it, in a way, we're kind of exercising the muscle that allows us to practice restraint when we're out in the world. Not that we should always restrain activity, because we're human. There are activities that are appropriate, activities that are skillful, activities that are beneficial. But I think we all know there are many responses that are not beneficial, not skillful, not helpful, and best avoided. So practicing the art of restraint is a way of, if you want to look at it as a practical skill, is a way of giving oneself time to consider before a response. So I've talked a little longer than I intended to here, so I think I'll stop at this point. And there is a little bit more of the Fukan Zazenji to discuss, and we'll continue that in future weeks, at least for a week or two. But I would be interested in thoughts about this notion of, what is Zazen? I've stated some opinions about what these passages mean. I don't pretend to be the world authority on it by any means. So there may be some other thoughts that one has, that other perspectives, other ways of looking at this that you might find valuable to share. And I think we'll, in that spirit, we'll break up into groups and discuss this or whatever else comes up. Thank you very much for listening.